Good everyone, how are you all doing? Today we'll be talking about the data types in MySQL, and we have various data types in SQL. We have the numeric data type, we have the string data type, and we have the date and time majorly. So now considering the numeric data type first. So numeric data types are basically numbers, and they are divided into two. We have the integer data types and we have the numbers data types. Now, integers are basically numbers, like I've said, and we all know that numbers can either positive or negative depending on the date and depending on what you want to store. Now, integers are subdivided into three. We have the tiny int, so basically tiny integer for full. So tiny integers, as name goes, is used to store very very small numbers, like age of a person, for example. We know the age of a person can be at most three letters, three digits. So, like on like being realistic, the age of a person cannot be more than 120 or 150 years of age. So we can say that it is a three digits data. So it can be stored, or a shoe size. We can see that we can a person can have a shoe size of 42 or 45. So we can see that they are very very small numbers. So now let's write the examples down. So for example, a shoe size, which can be like size 42. And we also realize that integers don't store decimal points, and we all know that for a shoe size, well, in some cases a shoe size can be 42.5, but I'm just being realistic that, and in most cases you also have unnumbered shoe size. So a shoe size of size 42, or a person's age of, let's say, 108 years old or 99 years of age, this can be stored using a small integer. I'll be using a tiny integer. Now moving on to a small integer. A small integers are integers, but they store more integers than tiny integers. Like for example, number of books in the library. We can know that in a big library we can have thousands of books, in fact 10,000s of books in a library. So a number of customers for a small business. So for an upcoming business, we can have 3,000 customers in a month, or 3,500 customers in a month. So you can see that you can see that it has stored an higher digit than these tiny integers. Now, someone will want to ask, okay, what are the range? They will need to know, okay, fine, if it exists this range, we are not going to use tiny integers to store our numeric data anymore and want to start using a small integer. So if our if the data I want to store is between the range of negative 128 to positive 127, then use a tiny integer to save it. And if the data I want to store is a positive data, and it has a range of 0 and it's only the range of 0 to 255, then use a tiny integer. But if our data exists this range, now for example, let's say you want to store a data set of, let's say, 128. Let's say we got okay, let's say our customer bought 128 number of goods. You can see that it has, okay, well, it's still within the range of this. But let's say we want to, store an integer that can be that positive or negative, and one of our customers now add the value of 128. So you can see that it has exceeded this value of this signed range. But if all our data is positive and our customer is within the range of 128 here, we can see that is still within this unsigned range, and tiny integer is actually still is still the best to consider. But now let's say that all our data is positive, like that means you are going to consider this unsigned range. So again, now let me take a recap of what I just said. If our data set is positive, you are going to consider this unsigned range. But if our data can be either positive or negative, we are going to use this signed range as our cut point. So if our data can be either positive or negative, and our customer bought 128 goods, for examples, we can see that we cannot use this signed range again. I will go to a small integer. But if all our data are positive, can be that 0 or infinity based on positive side, then we will go to this unsigned range. So if our customer buys a quantity of 256 goods or 258, we can see that it has exceeded this unsigned range, and we tend to store our data as a small integer. So moving on, a small integer can store an integer from a range of negative 32,000 to positive 32,000. And if our data is an unsigned range, that means if we are storing only a positive integers, then it can store within the range of 0 to 65,000. So most times we use a small integer because what do you want to store that we exceed this range? So I want to know what integers means. Integers are numbers, for example, counting numbers, or yeah, or like anything that's to do with numbers except decimal points. So you can have a value of minus 50 or minus 5,000. So you can have a profit of minus 5,000. That's going to be a loss. So you can have a profit of minus 8,000. It's still under this. We're still within this range of small ints. So you can have a profit of minus. You can have a profit of 80,000. So okay, 80,000 exceeds this range already, because you can see that the range is between minus 32,000 to positive 32,000, and if you are only storing a positive value, it's going to be within the range of 0 to 65,535. So now let's give an example of this small integer also. And also in MySQL, when writing a comment, like for example, you can see that all what I'm writing here are not codes but they are text. You use an hashtag to indicate that okay, I'm not coding but I'm writing a comment. So that's one of the small tips you need to know as an analyst. So moving on. So examples. So examples can be, so profit of 50,000, and I want us to know that it is for this example is on signed range, sorry. So then for a signed range, you can decide to have a profit of 30,000. You can see that a profit of 30,000 still falls in between this range. And let's be realistic, we all know that anything that has to do with finance, profit or loss, is basically can have a positive and negative value. So for anything that has to do with business, this is the range you are going to be using. This signed range is range you are going to be using. Now moving on to the big integers. A big integer is basically used to store a very, very large value. So anything that has to do with bank, because we all know that all these central bank, for example, all these big bank companies, they deal with billions and trillions of currencies. It can be billions of dollars or billions of pounds, or so those values are actually large and very large. So big integers are basically what the integer are going to use to account for them. So you can decide to store an integer of $1 million. So they are big integers. So big integers are mostly used in currency related data information, currency related data. That's when you use big integers for. Right? Small integers can be used on, can be more than profit. You can decide to use it to store the number of customers coming for a big company. Let's say the total number of customers coming to the company are 80,000, for example. You can see that it has exceeded this range and causing us to. And you can see that since you cannot have a negative value for total number of customers, so we are going to be using this unsigned range. So you can see that 80,000 has actually exceeded this. But let's say for total number of customers coming to a company, let's say 50,000, it's still within this range of small integers. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a currency. You can decide to store another entity. What I mean by entity is another concept. It can be total number of goods bought, it can be total number of currency, it can be total number of anything. So then moving on to the decimal. A decimal is basically used to store decimal numbers, as the name goes, and I'm also going to show us the format at which a decimal number is stored. So a decimal number is stored like this. Why m indicates m is the total number of digits, why n is the number of digits after the decimal points. So for example, let's say we want to store a value of 70.99. So number of digits is actually 4, because if you count it, it is 1 2 3 4. So number of digits after decimal points is 1 2. So if you want to store this value 70.99, this is how you are going to store it. These are how you are going to specify it. So I hope this video is understood. So if you have any question, you can reach out to me. Thank you very much and have a nice day.